By analyzing the probable impact of a rape, we can extrapolate some of the mechanisms by which impact, which is change, moves from one person to another. So if a bullet impacts my hand at 1,000 miles per hour, the impact is likely to be splintered bone, certainly a hand or a hole in the hand. There will be change in the hand. If a cannonball at 1,000 miles an hour impacts my hand, there won't be a recognizable hand left. And so impact equals change. All relationships produce change, but the nature of the change, the speed of the change, the degree of the change varies. And so let's look at a couple of formulas, and we'll use a rape analogy. So rape falls into the category of sex. And so the first equation will be emotional charge So emotional charge multiplied by the number of times the words or the pattern of sex have come up, right? So it begins in childhood. If a 5-year-old says, "What is sex?" and both parents freak out, looking at each other, "What's this one? Don't talk about this." And the child notices a similar amount of fear, say, or maybe more fear than a house burning down. The child says a house burning down, and maybe the parent says, whose house? And no big deal. But the child mentions sex, and it's worse than a house burning down. And so a child has to map out the danger and relative safety of these different meanings based initially on physiological response, right? Because the idea that a child has is, you're a giant, you've been around, you've survived. I'm small, I depend on you, I need to survive. Presumably, your map of reality, your map of meaning, is big enough, is useful enough to have kept you alive for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, right? And this is an instinctive acceptance. You've been around longer than me, you're bigger than me. My map of meaning, what matters and what means what, needs to defer to you. And so before words, the tonal and facial expressions around certain behavior is the primary map, right? Because there's no language. People's face will register different intensities of either expansive or constricting emotion. And so whatever brings about the most constriction, the most intensity, the most fear, the most shame, a constricting emotion that brings about the most intensity will be given a level 10, whatever that is, in the child's biology and the child's psychology. And in a puritanical and psychologically and to some extent sexually illiterate culture. Meaning there are literally people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s in this culture that don't know how to produce orgasm, that don't know about different types of orgasm, that don't know what produces pleasure, that don't feel comfortable enjoying their bodies, that are ashamed of their bodies, that think sex is somehow shameful, right? There are people, large numbers of them in our culture, that have a whole list of meanings around two bodies enjoying themselves that have nothing to do with the physiology and nothing innately to do with sex, but have a lot to do with cult memes that are intergenerational. And so sex, right, if that produces the most emotional constriction of any word, a child's biology will read sex as perhaps more dangerous than a fire, more dangerous than a gun, right? It depends, right? That will be mapped out family by family, child by child. But certainly, and then there's sex, and then there's talking about sex. So if every time sex is talked about, you get that, let's say, from your mother or from your father or from an aunt or something, you're again learning this is unspeakable. And everyone's going along with it. So you don't know what it is because it isn't spoken about, but you know it's unspeakable and you know it's really a big deal. Don't. And so you have these weights, and each of these equal, right? So let's say this weight equals 1,000. Now, how could it equal 1,000? Well, let's say that it has a 100 weight, meaning that it's built up. It's got 100 weight, and it's come up 10 times, or it's come up 100 times, and it has a weight of 10 out of 10. It's probably a better way of using that if we're using a 1 to 10 scale. So let's say it has a weight of 10. Your body has grasped that the subject of sex and talking about it is about as reactive and intense as your family system gets around anything, including death, right? You could literally grow up in a shame-based cult that is more reactive to the word sex than to death. That if someone says, I'm sorry if someone died, but there's no huge reaction. But you start to say, don't talk in front of the children, don't, and they don't say that about death, right? So these things are relative. And so you could have, 1,000 units of impact around sex, and then another 700 units of impact around talking around sex, maybe 8, maybe 9, whatever. And then you have being teased and witnessed people teased. You've witnessed being teased and been teased 150 times. And it's produced about 9 out of 10 in shame and confusion, etc., each of those 150 times. You've watched other people break down, hide in the bathroom, get flustered, have panic attacks, not come to school for several days, all kinds of things around teasing and humiliation. So you've now got sex as a completely unspeakable thing that causes massive amounts of shame and humiliation and social disaster, and that it's this really big deal. So now, let's say you've got another, 1,500 units of impact. So now, if you add up 1,000 plus 700 plus 1,500, you have 3,200 units of impact. Now, in a taboo, that's to start. In a taboo environment, things are unknown. They're unknown and they're unknown. Now, in a traumatic environment, the fear of the unknown, which correlates with the fear of being out of control, which correlates with the risk of re-traumatization in the mind of the traumatized person, the fear of the unknown is 8, 9 out of 10 painful, right? It's horrifying. And so you then have to amplify this because sex is unknown. And here's what's unknown. It's unknown why it's such a big deal. It's unknown how each individual person will react to it. It's unknown how it will affect me. It's unknown if my social life will explode and shatter, for example, and be traumatized through this thing. So we might take that up, to 10,000 units of charge around the word and the meaning sex. Now, then we have overlays of shame around, so we now have 10,200 units of charge, but now we turn that into a shame. And let's say it's 70% shame, because 70% of the messages you've got around that impact are, it's dirty, it's disgusting, it's this, it's that. So you've got the sense that it's now shameful. And you see that the people who are involved with it are the ones being shamed. You see that they're the ones being shamed. And so you realize that if it doesn't go the way you want, you're going to be carrying not just 10,200 units of impact in your body, in your psyche, in your mind, but you're going to be feeling shame about that. There's a 70% sense that somehow, I don't know exactly why, because it's never explained. Like, where is the shame coming from exactly? See, if you can talk about it, then someone says it's dirty, and you first of all say, is there any dirt involved? Oh, it's very dirty. So where's the dirt? Show me the dirt. Oh, I don't mean actual dirt. I mean that dirt is really bad, and so it's figuratively dirty. So there's no actual dirt in sex. There's just figurative dirtiness. So what's the problem with dirt? All plants grow from it. All animals eat and need plants. We eat plants. In fact, if it wasn't for dirt, there would not be any life on this planet. So what's the big problem with life on this planet? I mean, is life such a bad thing that we'd like to destroy all life? Would you like to kill all life by eliminating dirt? They say, no, it's a figure of speech. So why isn't it a blessing if it's the source of all life? We don't know. We're a cult, right? So cults behave a certain way. And so this is just what we've decided. If we want to slander or curse something, we call it dirty because we're not thinking straight. We're not thinking that the source of all life, dirt, is a blessing if we don't want to kill everything and everyone, right? And if we want to kill every single person and everything on the planet, all we have to do is get rid of all the dirt. And soon it'll all be dead, right? And so that bit makes absolute no sense, right? So dirtiness. Oh, and then they'll say like, well, cleanliness is next to godliness. You're saying there is a God in that statement. There is a God, and God created the earth, which is a synonym for dirt. So God created the dirt. God didn't create the absence of dirt. That's people's fanaticism, right? God created earth or dirt, and out of that all things grew, if you believe in God, which if you're quoting a cleanliness is next to godliness, well then, why are you saying God created this horrible thing that gave birth to all life? So that doesn't really hold up either, right? So then you just say, well, we've just decided that clean people are superior to people with stains of mud on them. Well, that's arguable. If you think of someone doing something useful, gardening, growing food, they're going to get mud on them. And if you think of someone doing something less useful, signing bits of paper, moving stuff around, they don't get dirt on them. Are you saying that all the important work, putting out fires, agriculture, going for walks, playing, are you saying that's inferior to being dissociated with one's environment? Well, you can see there is some of that, but that's you can talk that through and realize it's nonsense, if you could talk it through. But when all you do is have parents that show the most constrictive emotions around when they say the word dirty, so first of all, they associate intense contraction, pain and fear, etc., with the word dirt. They do that. It doesn't need to make any sense. Now, the child learns biologically that something's dangerous and bad about dirt because their parents' tone and faces say that there's something bad by the way they're being. Well, then when you're called dirty, all that badness gets transferred to you, right? So all those muscles, right? It's dirty, 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 right? So that builds up a charge around dirt. It doesn't need to make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't need to be intelligent. It isn't intelligent. It's profound stupidity. But it is intelligent for a child that can't think to instinctively take on the biases of their cult. And so now dirt, the source of all life, a synonym for earth, which Christians say God created, right? Well, then that's now a really, really bad word physiologically. And then when that gets turned to you, you're dirty because you enjoyed your body, right? Now, all that charge gets taken on. Like, I'm the source of all that angst that I've seen on my parents' faces, on my teachers' faces, on my, psychologically inept priests' faces, right? All that rage and it's now me because I did this thing, enjoyed my body in this way. So now there's shame, which is a social trauma. Then there's the fact that in a psychologically illiterate culture, nobody knows how to respond to all of this, how to talk about it, how to understand it, etc. So when someone is raped, the cult says that that's dirty. That shouldn't have happened, right? So, but both people are participants in the rape. One is causing it, the other is allowing it. Now, they may not be preferring it, they may be struggling, but they're still participating by being raped. Right? There's a participation at some level, right? Now that level goes down the more someone is a child, and it goes up the more something is, if you happen to know there's a lot of rapes in a given alley and you dress somewhat sexily and hang out at 2 a.m. flirting with gang members, there's more participation because you understand that your odds of being raped are going up. Or if you are curious about sex or whatever and, just want to see what happens, or you have a rape fantasy, the participation is higher. But whatever the cult now associates with this word rape is now associated with both people. You were raped and they raped you. But the charge around the word rape, that's horrible, that's ugly, that's disgusting, that connects both people to some degree, to the degree that it is identified. Like, you are a rape survivor. Oh, I am? Well, what does that mean? Well, then all of that charge and all of that meaning, right? So all the meaning about sex, all the meaning about dirt, all the meaning about rape, all the shame, all the gossip, all the exclusion, like, oh, don't say anything, she's coming, pretend nothing's happening. That's exclusion. What are you talking about? Nothing. That's exclusion. That's lies, that's exclusion. And exclusion and lies also send the message that it cannot be talked about. Often it can be talked about, right? It's profoundly irritating to be in a position where you've experienced something that you'd like to kind of clear the air around, but everyone pretends that it didn't exist, and how's the weather? And so you're now excluded. And exclusion has a biological message of shame, right? My friends aren't being themselves around me. There must be something wrong with me. Now, the other element in this is progression and regression. So life naturally becomes more complex, more developed, grows, matures. Trees start very small and get more and more big and complex and grow. Human beings grow. Psychological development occurs. A child is in a completely innocent state in that they accept whatever is around them as just the way things are, and they don't critically think about it. If a 5-year-old sees people wandering around with plates in their mouth and pulling their lips out to put in bigger and bigger plates, and everyone bows down to the person who has a big plate in their lip, this is one cult tradition, then the 5-year-old accepts that that's obviously the way things are done, right? If a 5-year-old sees someone taking 30 spouses and based on how much money they have, well, then that's just the way it is. If a 5-year-old sees people eating caterpillars and ants, well, obviously that's the food to eat. If a 5-year-old sees someone speaking English, well, then that's the code we'll use in this lifetime, right? And so whatever's going on around, the childlike state accepts it. Now, as we grow up, we get more critical. We evaluate. In adolescence, we analyze and say, that doesn't make sense, that's dumb, this and that. So we move from sympathy, blind acceptance, to antipathy, a reactive rejection of what is, based on critical thinking. And then we move into adulthood, which is synergy and synthesis of the best of what has been, rejecting the worst of what has been, and creating something new. Now, the older the person is and the larger their body, the more, the less something on the outside impacts them, right? If you tell a child, if a parent communicates to a 5-year-old that they hate the 5-year-old, and they're going to leave them, this is a profoundly traumatic event. And it's about scale. The smaller something is, the bigger something is by comparison, right? So if this is very, very tiny, then this gets bigger in relationship. So everything is big. Everyone is a giant to a 5-year-old, to a 2-year-old, right? Now, trauma tends to regress someone into a younger psychological state where they look out of the eyes of a child and then everything looks big. So if there is trauma, which shame is a trauma, involved in the rape, then there is a feeling, if there's trauma, and there's a feeling that it's very, very big. The world is very, very big. So I'm much more frightened of it and I'm much more affected by it. So if something affected me, 10,200 units of impact as a grown-up, that same 10,200 units of impact, if you feel 5 times smaller, now we've got, 6,000 units of impact relative to the psychological state, right? So the smaller we become, the more big the impact is, and the more helpless we feel. And if there isn't help available when we're in shock and in a traumatized state, we go from progression to regression, and we start dealing with reality as an infant, as a child. It's called regression. The smaller we get, the bigger the event is relative to how big we feel. So it's a very important element in understanding impact. And the more we regress, the more we relate to the world as a child. Now, this is very important around identity, because the child forms their picture of reality that everything is wrong is their fault. So if we're regressed and we're looking at being raped, then it's our fault that we've been raped, because that's how a child sees it. Now, if the child takes on, 10,000 units of shame and fear and constriction, and says that it's all my fault, and I'm bad, and I'm dirty, and then this is happening in a traumatic terrain. So the identity, the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being is very liquid in a traumatic state, because the original pattern is shattered, is broken. So the ego, which feels very insecure, not knowing what its boundaries are and who it is, the ego is trying to attach itself to a strong pattern. And the pattern of being bad and the pattern of being shameful and unlovable and unwanted is a very strong pattern. Pattern of being a victim is a very strong pattern, because it's very hard to knock off, because if more trauma happens, the identity strengthens. And if less trauma happens with PTSD, you can still remember the pattern of energy over and over again, and you can recreate the identity, the attachment to the new pattern. And so now you have the ego's desperate fear of the unknown and its need to know who it is, searching for something and attaching to the victim identity and the trauma and the traumatic event. It's my fault, and I am a rape survivor. That's who I am. I'm bad, it's my fault, and I'm a rape survivor. Now, the ego has this very strong identity. It's very hard to and it doesn't want to let that go for fear of the unknown, because the more traumatized you are, the more you want to hold on to what you know. And I know this identity. I am a victim. I am dirty. I am bad. I'm tainted, right? And many people will agree, right? You're on a date and someone says, what are some of the big experiences in your life? And you say, well, I was raped. Many people will buy in to the cult message. Or if you say, I'm an incest survivor. Many cult members, that sounds like a very dirty word, and all I know that it's now associated with you, so you're dirty. So I'm not attracted to you anymore. And then the identity, the ego, says, see, I'm bad, I'm ugly, because I was raped, because I'm an incest survivor, right? So it goes round and round, right? People feed into it, people hold on to it. It feels very safe and secure because it's a pattern that repeats itself. All the ego is looking for is a pattern that protects it from the unknown. All the traumatized ego is looking for. So now you have an ego that says, I am this. It's not just that this happened, I am this. And the ego, in its fear of the unknown, has to reinforce the pattern to know who it is. It has to remember the abuse, has to relive the experience, and has to take up a role within that drama that it is remembering and reliving. And one of the best ways to do that is to reenact the trauma from time to time. Find someone else who will rape me, or think about it, or find someone else who looks at me as if I'm bad and disgusting. Because now, that's who I am. I'm bad, I'm disgusting, that's me. It's my pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. My physiology, that's my words, that's me. I'm that. Who are you? I'm a rape survivor. And what does that look like? Well, I kind of skirt around, I feel ashamed, I feel like I'm bad, I apologize for things I don't do. That's what I do. That's who I am. That's what I think, that's what I feel, that's what I do, that's what I say, right? So that's the I identifying, attaching to a pattern, to an image that's now bound up in the abuse. And I feel weak if people are being too nice to me and loving me, and because that doesn't fit with my identity. My identity starts to crumble. I thought I was bad and people are being nice to me, so I've got to go be around different people who will treat me poorly so that I can strengthen my identity. Otherwise, I don't know who I am. Like, I thought I was this. So, and often the ego will attach to the strongest, most coherent identity or pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being available. And often that is the traumatic event. So PTSD is a traumatic identification with the worst moments of our lives that are relived to strengthen the ego's identity, its pattern. Now, when we treat ourselves and see ourselves in a certain way, we're projecting a role and a screen out onto others. And it is very normal particularly for psychologically illiterate, unconscious cult members of any culture, to just copy and fit into our projection. If we're putting out the role, I'm bad, I'm scared, I did something wrong, and we're behaving that way, they will start seeing us. They look furtive. They look like a criminal. Doesn't matter that they didn't commit any crime. They look that way, so they probably did. So then they start treating people who look furtive and shy. They then assume that they actually did something wrong and treat them as such. And so then it reinforces the identity, projection, identification. So this now can become an entire lifetime, right? Through this process of unconscious participation, of, sexual illiteracy, of all kinds of ignorance and incompetence in responding to PTSD, someone who was walking down the street and for 5 minutes of their life, somebody touched their penis or vagina in a certain way and stimulated this, that can then become the defining moment of the ego identifying and thus projecting and then holding on to that, and of people responding to that identity and projection. And an entire life shifts around a 5, 10, or 15-minute event that largely consists of skin moving around in what it can be a pleasurable experience. People can have a pleasurable experience being raped, which just means that the sex is initiated without consent and sometimes with strong protest. And that becomes, the single biggest event of a life, not because it would in another cult, right? In another cult or culture, where rape was the way to show how, like the person who was raped the most is the most beautiful person in the world, for example. That's a different cult with different meanings. And if everyone said, when I was raped, it was so exciting in my teenage years, when I was raped, I never knew when it would happen, right? I'd be going along, I'd sometimes wear, my good clothes and stuff, and it was so exciting. Sometimes this strong person would grab me and do this and do that, and other times it's like so exciting. You can't wait until we don't let people rape, 10-year-olds, but wait until you're 15 and can, and the suspense is very interesting, and then we count up who was raped the most, and that becomes, the community's most attractive person, right? They have, issues with, in some tribes, for example, in Tibet and Nepal, the man, without the consent of the woman, will send 5 or 6 of his friends, and they will kidnap the bride and carry her to the man. And then they will get married the next day. And the kidnapping is what determines the marriage, not the consent of the woman, right? And sometimes it works out well, and sometimes it doesn't, just like, any relationship. And then, very often they live happily or unhappily ever after, but basically a gang of guys seizes a girl or a woman at some point as she's going through her life, takes her to the bridegroom, and that's how it is, right? Now, the in such a culture, a woman might have more shame if nobody kidnapped her, because that means that there wasn't any of the men nearby that wanted to marry her through the ritual of kidnapping, right? And of course, it's not kidnapping. There's no nap and there's no kid. So, 5 of his friends seizing a woman and taking her off. But you can see the difference, right? You could call that kidnapping. You could call it a hostage scenario. And if everyone was all excited, but if all the giants, as you're 5 years old, say, "Oh, when is Sophia going to be kidnapped? When are the guys coming for Sophia? Why? She's such a lovely woman. Why has no one come for her?" And then Sophia's saying, "Oh, I hope someone kidnaps me this year, right? Because, I want to be kidnapped before my sister." And you have all of this type of meaning. So you've now got 1,000 meanings around, how important it is. And the family gains rank, right? You see dad walking more proudly because his daughter was kidnapped yesterday, right? By an important family, by an important other family, right? The prince of the region, right? Kidnapped my daughter, aren't I important, right? So when you see all of that happening, thousands of times, then you could be kidnapped and taken to your husband and let's have sex. And this could be the greatest thing imaginable, right? Hooray, hooray, it's about time, that you've been kidnapped and all of this. So a tremendous amount of this is created by first the biology and then the cultural significance and meanings, and whether it's an up rank or a down rank for the family and the various people, right? Certain Muslims in the Philippines, an older, 50, 60, 70, 80-year-old Muslim may buy a 14-year-old girl from a family and basically, offer the parents, $100,000 or whatever, something that's going to say, look, you don't need your daughter to take care of you in your old age, which is a common Asian tradition. This money will do so. And this is good for your family. And if the cult agrees, rightly or wrongly, if the cult agrees and says, this is wonderful that the richest person or the highest ranking or the whatever, or whoever's paid the most money or whatever, has done this. And then the parents will tell the daughter that she is lucky, this is a wonderful thing. And if both parents have shown affection and interest in the child, and if they're convinced that this is a great thing, and if her friends say, "Oh, I wish I was the 4th wife of the Sultan," or whatever it was, then that will have a tremendous impact, right? She may or may not like certain aspects of the dynamic, but the meaning, the story, that I'm a wonderful, lucky person or I'm an unlucky person, right? She may be picked with someone she really likes, who's her own age, who has the type of touch and smile that she finds beautiful, but her parents may say, "No, that's a horrible family. You've had bad luck. That's a poor family." And so the opposite may be true, right? So she feels like, well, I really like him, but everyone says, "Oh, look at her. She got stuck with so-and-so, who's a baker as opposed to a sultan," right? And so-and-so's. And so the rank which is a cult phenomena. And the degree of that is determining the rank of the person on the dimension of love and belonging, right? Because in a cult, there is a hierarchy. And the top of the hierarchy are invited and envied and given opportunities everywhere. And the bottom of the hierarchy are shamed and not considered important. And that has, in many cases, more impact psychologically and physically and traumatically than what is actually happening. Right? I remember a story in school. I'd started a new school in Sussex, England, as an American. And my father had taken me to Oxfam. And Oxfam is a British charity that takes used clothing donations, sells them to the public, and raises money for charity. And Michael always liked buying used clothing, thought it was an intelligent use of money, and also enjoyed supporting charity. And I hadn't gotten the message that secondhand clothes were something to be ashamed of. And so my British classmates asked me where I got some piece of clothing, and I said, Oxfam. And the entire class began chanting, Oxfam rejects. Apparently that was the stereotype, which was that Oxfam would take the rejected clothing from manufacturers or something and then sell those to raise money for charity. Oxfam rejects. And I thought these kids were complete imbeciles. I thought they were nuts. And I said, I can't believe you guys are all focusing on pieces of clothes and where they were bought. You don't have anything worthwhile to think about, to do, right? And the thing made no sense to me whatsoever. And so I hadn't grown up in the shaming of the British cult around used clothing or Oxfam. And so the thing was a joke to me. It had no impact. I look around and I'm like, these fools, 20 of them. How, where did Britain raise all these fools that 20 kids would chant a ridiculous slogan? You think I don't have ears to hear it the first time? I mean, don't you have anything else to say? And they all eventually felt ashamed because I wasn't taking on their shame. They felt ashamed, they kind of went back to their thing and they let it go, right? Because they hadn't gotten a scapegoat to humiliate that would hide and that they could torment. They'd gotten someone thinking that was pointing out what idiots they were. It's like, you really think that chanting Oxfam rejects is cool, is what to do with, I mean, I couldn't even begin to understand it. And they got the message, right? They got the message that this is ridiculous. And so I hadn't got any shame. They stopped it. But if I had a father, for example, who always hid that he had used clothes and he said, don't let anyone know you have used clothes. It's a horrible thing. I'm so ashamed that I give. If I had had all of that and they had piled in and 20 people had all pushed that button, then I would have had all my father's shame times 20. And it would have been crushing, for a 10-year-old. As it was, I just laughed, right? And thought that, and there were other ridiculous things they did. They would mention TV slogans that made no sense, right? There was a Blackadder I think, show at the time, and there was this song like "Throw a Chicken in the Air," and they were all chanting, "Throw a chicken in the air, put a breadstick up your nose." And I just looked at them. I said, I mean, where do you get all this bullshit? I mean, you're all chanting the same thing? No original thoughts? You all think throwing a chicken in the air is useful, right? And so, you know, this just sounded like complete nonsense. But it made sense to them because they'd all seen it on television. And I didn't have a TV, right? So there was a clash, basically, in cult shaming. Because I had been raised to think that thinking was, you know, a good activity. And what they were doing there was no way you could arrive at a good thought based on what they were doing or saying. And so they were inferior as thinkers. But I was inferior for not having a TV and not chanting about throwing chickens in the air, and for supporting charity by having pants from Oxfam. And for being an American, right? Which I also didn't get what, you know, how that made me inferior, right? So what I'm getting at is a lot of this biological programming is unconscious, and unless you deprogram it, your body will react at 10,000 units of charge for some subject that you've learned at age 2, 3, 4, when you didn't have a brain to critically analyze it. Your body just took on that this is really important because 20 giants around you are behaving as if it's the end of the world. And so you just unconsciously accept that. But that weight is now triggerable. It can now be pushed around by other people. It's there unless you deprogram it. It's a brainwashing of sorts. And so one of the things that, the conclusions of this is that the cult brainwashing, the cult meaning of many of these things is more impactful than the actual thing. Don't come back, you rotten person, you're going to rot in hell. All of that is more meaningful in many cases than what, right? Because you have other examples of this where you're apparently going to go to hell in certain centuries of Christianity if you masturbate. You're going to go blind, you're going to go to hell, it's this horrible thing. So it's not, you can see that, there were times in the last few hundred years that boys were more ashamed of masturbating, meaning willingly pleasuring their own body, than of being raped. Because rape wasn't talked about, and so it couldn't have quite as much charge around it. Rape was denied at the time, right? So the charges there are based on the cult influence to a large extent. And it can also be in the projection and identification of the rape and the raper, right? Because if somebody is in the trance of wonder, let's say they've read Italian operas and they seize a woman and passionately kiss her and they say, oh, you're so beautiful, you're so beautiful. If the person is disoriented and tries to identify with the counterpoint role in that projection, she becomes a beautiful goddess who is irresistible, right? On the other hand, you could take someone who thinks of themselves as a lovely goddess, but when she looks into the eyes of the person raping her, she sees contempt, she sees hatred, she sees rage and hostility, and I want you to feel like nothing. You are nothing, and I want you to feel that way. Well, then in the shock of shattered identity, there's a very strong projection coming that you're nothing, and they may take it on. Just say, I guess I'm nothing, and start identifying then with being nothing, and that I'm bad and regression and all of that. But it is the identification and what the identity is that is the most impactful part. If I come away from a rape feeling I'm bad, I'm ugly, I will always be bad and ugly, I have to keep a dirty secret because I'm dirty and dirty is bad, and that's me, that will affect me immensely for the rest of my life as long as I identify. If I come away and say, I'm in a strange land where people cannot just enjoy the beauty of sex and say, hey, oh, you're so lovely. I just really would love to kiss and fondle and play around and, oh, you're just so gorgeous. How, is there any good times for you? And where someone would say, well, thank you for the compliment. I'm free on Wednesday or whatever. And, we're not in that cult, right? So if we're in a cult, that's frustrated and we just say, oh, this seems like a very frustrated cult where people have all kinds of strange ideas around touch. There's nothing to do with me. And, they're all believers of their cult. And so I guess this is what they do. This person is a bit rough with me, and this person runs, and this person calls the police, and that person shouts out strange words at me. I'm just a person who's had a few minutes of my life. This has happened, and now I'm a person who's going to do this and going to do that. I'm now a person taking a shower, and now I'm a person this. Then it doesn't have the lifetime of impact. Right? It's the identification that is the biggest impact, and it is the projection and influence of the cult that has the biggest probability setting of what that identification is going to be.